There are two ways to look at any historical event: coincidental and conspiratorial. One is to see a whole mess of coincidences that just happen to fit together. A lot, maybe most of the world's events are just like that. People make choices. Those choices have consequences, and those consequences affect other events further down the road, leading to a major event. It is just a coincidence that they occurred in any particular order. The other way is to see connections between events that just might have had a finger, so to speak, pushed on the side of the scale to tip things in one direction. This view sees two sides to many situations and two different outcomes each side is rooting for. As Christians, we know about one great conspiracy. The devil and his angels want to keep people out of the kingdom of God. And they'll do anything to achieve it. The devil's goal, as stated in the Bible, is one world kingdom, religion, and worship of Satan. The question for us today is, what can we learn about an event like the sinking of the Titanic? Whether you see a series of coincidences or connected events, I would like you to consider what I'm about to show you. A set of events that formed a perfect storm, so to speak, that changed the modern world from the day that it struck. Here is what I think is the simplest explanation of what really happened to the Titanic. I'll let you decide which view of history you think this falls into: coincidental or conspiratorial. Hi, I'm David Daniels from Chick Publications. There are two views on banking in the world. There are those who favor one big central bank. Nowadays, we call those people globalists. Then there are people who would rather not be under a single world power. We often call those people nationalists. The Titanic offered first-class accommodations for anyone who could afford it, globalist or nationalist, from the world's wealthiest down to the poor folks, such as those hoping for a better life in America. It was like a giant floating hotel that had something for everyone, from prince to peasant. On the globalist side were booked passengers like John Pierpont Morgan, who heavily favored and was pushing for a huge central bank. He was also the owner, loosely speaking, of the White Star Line, which means he owned Titanic. On the nationalist side were ticket holders like Jewish Benjamin Guggenheim and Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's, and White Star regular John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest man on the ship. Astor boarded in the French port of Cherbourg, but 55 rich men on the globalist side coincidentally all backed out at the last moment. J.P. Morgan, Morgan's business partner, ambassador to Paris, Robert Bacon, just a few days to go, chocolate king Milton Hershey, steel tycoon Henry Frick, and shipping and railroad magnate George Vanderbilt. J.P. Morgan tried to explain not getting on the boat, citing ill health, but he was later spotted in excellent health, along with his mistress. His art collection also coincidentally just missed the boat. All these would, coincidentally, benefit from a centralized bank and its amazing loans. A little more about the Astors. In Buffalo, New York, in 1852, Charles Chinnicky, former Catholic priest, heard these words spoken by Catholic priests sent by the bishops of the United States. Quote, "Silently and patiently we must mass our Roman Catholics in the great cities of the United States, remembering that the vote of a poor journeyman, though he be covered with rags, has as much weight in the scale as the millionaire Astor, and that if we have 2 votes against his 1, he will become as powerless as an oyster. Or you could just kill him before he opposed your plan for a centralized bank, setting the world into a financial frenzy. But how would you bring this about? With the simplest of items, coal. Now, let's put together some historical events. Starting at the end of January 1912, the United Kingdom experienced a coal workers' strike. During a strike, people are not mining coal, so it's not easy to get coal to fill up the biggest coal-burning ship in the world, Titanic. Its coal bins were 3 stories high. It had 159 coal-burning furnaces. It burned up over 600 tons of coal each day. And that's only under normal conditions. If something were to happen, like say, more coal have to be burned because of slowing down and having to speed up again, that would increase the amount of coal burned, obviously. But there was another way to burn more coal. Piling coal 3 stories high put a lot of heat and pressure on that coal. And according to coal experts, spontaneous fires can start. And they can start pretty close to the time they were loaded into the ship, smoldering and increasing as oxygen is able to fan the flames, so to speak. According to those same coal fire experts, it could be burning for days or weeks before anyone would notice it. Did you know that there are coal fires in the world that have been burning for years underground? There are coal seams that are inaccessible and that burn untold amounts of coal because no one can put them out. But on a ship, you have a limited supply of coal. So what do? If you were right there in the port of, say, Southampton, on the south end of England, there were firefighting facilities that could have taken care of the whole thing rather rapidly. But the captain never called for them. Nor did he tell the ship's inspector about the fire. Instead, for some unknown reason, he chose to have 12 extra firemen deal with it while at sea. How would you do that? One method is to get someone shoveling as close as possible to where the fire is. Remember, it's really hot. To loosen up the burning parts, then they get those burning parts out and toss them into the boiler furnaces. That uses up extra coal. But there is the hope of eventually getting all the smoldering coals out of the bin. That was the procedure used on the Titanic. You see, one of those fires started in bunker number 10, boiler room 6, as many as 3 weeks before it was noticed. Remember that coal strike? It had ended just 4 days before Titanic docked at Southampton. Not enough time to get a bunch of new coal to refill the ship. That left the captain with few options. Along with the fact that some very wealthy people were boarding on the maiden voyage of a whole new type of luxury liner, and people did not like delays, there were all sorts of other pressures placed on this 26-year veteran captain of the White Star Line. The coal supply kept getting smaller and smaller. There was a long way to go to Cherbourg in France to get the rich folk, to Queensborough, now called Cobb, Ireland for the poorer bulk of passengers, to the long journey across the Atlantic to America. The captain had to stretch the coal he had left all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. That would mean no slowing down. Once they got up to speed, about 22 to 23 knots per hour, it takes a lot more coal to get going fast again. And it'll be a race against time to get that smoldering fire out, throwing that hot coal into the furnaces on top of the coal already there. That would explain why Captain Edward John Smith ignored all notices about those ice fields up ahead. He'd gotten at least 3 warnings himself. But Captain Smith foolishly trusted in the Titanic, of which an official of the White Star Lines commented at its launch a year before, May 31st, 1911, "Not even God himself could sink the ship." I doubt that God was impressed. There were certain things that Captain Smith didn't know. In a huge project like Titanic, there are engineers and there are penny pinchers. If you ask an engineer to make a coffee thermos that will keep a person warm in Antarctica, he or she will do it. It will cost thousands of dollars, but a freezing person in a blizzard will get a steaming cup of coffee. It will have every protection known to mankind. It will work. My hat's off to engineers. But the penny pinchers, they seem to take the greatest pleasure in saying no. No, we can't afford that. No, you use this cheaper material, not that more expensive one. And so it was with Titanic. Records show that the engineers picking a super strong steel that should withstand all sorts of problems. Don't forget, engineers made icebreaker boats that literally cut their way through ice. It isn't a problem if they use the right materials. But the penny pinchers wouldn't let them use that super strong steel. They said, no, you use regular steel that we tell you. And grumbling under their breath, you'll be sorry, they're forced to use the cheaper steel. And that's what they did to Titanic. Big mistake. Captain Smith didn't know that. He thought they'd just plow through anything with that super steel, full speed ahead, maybe make it to New York before their supply of coal ran out. Yes, he was worried, but he trusted his ship. Maybe too much. Because that inferior steel had been superheating against the starboard, the right side, for days, and according to experts, up to 3 weeks, and weakened a line so clearly it could be seen on photographs that were only discovered in the last decade. The photos were taken on April 2nd, the very day the Titanic was tested for 12 hours for seaworthiness, and at 8 p.m. sent from Belfast down to Southampton to get its first passengers. Some would think, a coal fire? How could that be a problem? They could just put it out like any fire. Actually, no. Think about this. There were 160 firemen, people who took the coal from the bins and shoveled it into the boilers on that ship when it arrived in Southampton. 152 of those 160 men got off. Only 8 stayed on the ship for the voyage. Natives from around Southampton who didn't know about the fire took their place. And according to later testimony, they never did get that fire out themselves. What did it? The cold waters of the Atlantic after hitting that iceberg. So yeah, I think maybe it was serious. Aside from the firefighters, 12 of whom were set to nothing else but trying to put out that fire 24/7, almost no one else knew or alerted the passengers to that fire. And almost no one knew about the inferior steel on the hull and all over the Titanic. Not even the captain knew, as I said. So no one knew they were headed towards disaster. I hope a good number of those men, women, and children were saved. They had no idea that on April 15th, their souls would be required of them, as Jesus said. Jesus shed his precious blood to pay for all their sins. All we have to do is trust in his finished work and not ourselves, anyone or anything else, admitting we're sinners and accepting his sacrifice for us, asking forgiveness. And we're saved. All by that simple childlike act of faith. If they did this, those people were in heaven way before they expected it. For the rest, first, it was very cold. Then, it was very hot. But I think there is more to this than meets the eye even now. Let me tell you about Francis Brown. Francis was but a child when his mother died. When he was a teen, his father died as well, leaving him an orphan. His uncle took him in and became his guardian. His uncle, Robert Brown, was bishop of the town of Cloyne in County Cork, Ireland. Francis decided he wanted to become a Jesuit. But his uncle wanted him to see Europe first, bought Francis a camera and sent him across Europe. Francis loved photography. He became quite good at it too. In his last year of Jesuit formation, before being ordained a Jesuit priest, Bishop Brown bought a first-class ticket for Francis from Southampton, England, up to Queenstown, or Cobb, in Ireland, for that last stop of the Titanic before sailing across the Atlantic. He also gave him special letters of introduction so they would let this young Jesuit take pictures all over the ship, and he did. A rich American family liked Francis. They offered to buy a ticket all the way to New York. He asked for permission by telegraph. The Jesuit provincial was adamant. He replied, "Get off that ship." Provincial. Get off that ship. That telegram saved his life. But unusual words, aren't they? Get off that ship. Why? Something wrong with it? Did the Jesuit provincial know something? That brings me to the final thoughts. If you see history as random coincidences, as surely a lot of it is, then none of this makes you stop and think. But if you see some things might be conspiracies, add up these simple points. 1, the coal strike meant no quick replenishing of coal once it was used up. 2, the information seems to indicate that the fire started very soon after the coal was placed into the 3-story high coal bins. 3, the fire was near the bottom of the bunker, which means it would not be discovered for 3 weeks, according to the coal fire experts. 4, that fire weakened the inferior steel hull in the exact place where the iceberg hit. This is according to the firemen's own testimonies. And they were there, in boiler number 6. 5, the rip that it caused and the temperatures warped important parts of that watertight casing. 6, all that made more than 4 compartments fill up with water, which was too much for the Titanic to bear. The ship went down in only 15 minutes after that. 7, the people who would soon benefit from the globalist bankers and their central bank and Federal Reserve canceled their reservations at the last minute. 8, the people who opposed a central bank, blissfully unaware of any problems, boarded the ship. 9, the world went into financial panic after these people died, and the central bank was soon born, moving toward the Roman Catholic goal of one world government to be ruled by one world religion. In light of that, do you think that just maybe someone tipped the scales a bit by sending a little flame into the bottom of that coal bunker? I will leave you to decide. God bless you and have a wonderful day.
On April 10th, 1912, RMS Titanic set out on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York.
Britain's wonder of the world, Titanic, the 46,000-ton liner, set out proudly on her maiden voyage to America.
On the night of April 14th, the ship struck an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean. 2.5 hours later, the world's newest and greatest ocean liner sank below the waves. Over 1,500 people died in the freezing waters. Since the day of the disaster, legend has overtaken fact, and there are many questions surrounding the sinking. Was the voyage doomed from the start? Could the accident have been avoided? Who benefited financially? Was it even the Titanic that actually sank? Theories have encircled this tragedy for over a century, and we're about to set the record straight.
I'm Stu, this is Debunked, and we're here to sort the truths from the myths and the facts from the misconceptions.
The unsinkable ship.
Titanic, the 46,000-ton liner that couldn't sink.
It's a classic case of dramatic irony.
So this is the ship they say is unsinkable.
It is unsinkable. God himself could not sink this ship.
Movies and novels love to point out that the owners of the Titanic boasted that it was unsinkable.
But this ship can't sink.
But was this ever actually said? Well, yes and no. White Star Line, the company that owned Titanic, sold the ocean liner on its luxury rather than its indestructibility. And luxury is what passengers were interested in. After all, if you spent the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money on a top-class Titanic ticket, you'd be more interested in the swimming pool, the walk-in wardrobes, and the 10-course dinners than the height of the bulkheads. Still, Titanic was the most advanced ship ever built at the time, and a brochure published in 1910 does say,
"As far as it is possible to do so, this wonderful vessel is designed to be unsinkable."
However, the moment that popularised the unsinkable boast didn't happen until after the Titanic hit the iceberg. In New York, a man called Philip Franklin was in charge of White Star Line's office on the night of April 15th, 1912. When the first news came through over the radio that Titanic was in distress, he tried to reassure the passengers' worried relatives and reporters by telling them,
"There is no danger that Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers."
After this, the words Titanic and unsinkable became inseparable, but only ironically. The Wrath of God. Legend has it that Catholic workers in Titanic's shipyard refused to work because its hull number, 390904, written backwards, spells no Pope. For one thing, the number was never assigned to Titanic in any way. On the other hand, it's true that Catholic yard workers didn't work on Titanic because they weren't hired to. The company that built Titanic prided itself on the fact that it only hired Protestants. However, another story purportedly proves Titanic was doomed. As you know, whether you're going to sea or outer space, it's tradition to christen a ship by breaking a bottle of champagne over its bow, but when it came to christening the Titanic, the bottle refused to break. Although it's true that no champagne bottle ever smashed against Titanic, this is because it's a purely optional tradition that White Star Line didn't follow. Instead, they kept all 12,000 bottles of wine intact for the passengers to drink. Most of those bottles are still with the shipwreck, and might still be drinkable even today.
Bottles kept at the bottom of the sea are better kept than in the finest wine cellars.
The Curse of Titanic. Another myth says Titanic suffered the curse of an Egyptian mummy in its hold. The cargo manifests prove there was no mummy on board the Titanic. This story almost certainly comes from the Washington Post. Less than a month after Titanic sank, the Post ran an article about William T. Stead, a journalist who drowned when Titanic went down. And the Washington Post reported that he believed strongly in the curse of a mummy that was brought to the British Museum in 1889. Except it's just the painted lid of a wooden coffin. In fact, the whole curse was invented by Stead himself just for fun, and he told it to his fellow passengers on board Titanic. When survivors recounted this, the Washington Post put the disaster and the mummy together. Presto, curse concocted. Weirdly, in 1886, William Stead wrote a short story about a steamship that sinks and doesn't have enough lifeboats aboard, resulting in unnecessarily high casualties. Which brings us on to the next common misconception about Titanic. Titanic's lifeboats. One of the most tragic facts about the Titanic is that there weren't enough lifeboats for all the people on board. This is often attributed to corporate greed and a callous disregard for human life, at least for humans who hadn't bought a first-class ticket.
Open the gate!
The idea that the class prejudice led to many unnecessary deaths is often backed up by the claim that third-class passengers were locked below decks while the ship sank. It's absolutely true that there were lockable gates on Titanic's lower decks because US immigration control required it, and these gates were locked at night. But as soon as the order to lower the lifeboats was given, the gates were open too. The bigger problem third-class passengers faced was the sheer distance between their quarters and the lifeboats on the top deck. It's not a huge surprise that 60% of first-class passengers survived, compared to 25% of third-class passengers, when poorer passengers had farther to go to reach the limited spaces on the lifeboats. But while it is true that Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats to save everyone, the shipbuilders actually provided more lifeboats than were required by law. Regulations were based on the size of a ship and not the number of people on board. In 1912, the Board of Trade required British vessels that weighed over 10,000 tons to carry 16 lifeboats with capacity for just 50% of the passengers and crew. Titanic had 20 lifeboats, enough for 52% of the people on board. So in fact, Titanic exceeded requirements of the time. Sadly, the tragedy was exacerbated by the fact that the lifeboats were not used to their full capacity. Records show that the most loaded lifeboat was at 88% capacity. The least full lifeboat held only a third of the people it was designed to carry. This may partly be a result of the famous order to evacuate women and children first, a command that really was given by Captain Edward Smith.
I'm ordering all women and children into the boats.
This gave rise to a story that one man snuck onto a lifeboat by disguising himself in women's clothing. This is false. For one thing, 4 different men were accused of being the cowardly crossdresser. The extensive inquiries into the sinking prove that all 4 of these men got onto lifeboats in perfectly permissible pantalooned fashion. In the case of William T. Sloper, the accusation came from a reporter who was annoyed that he was refusing to talk to the press, and J. Bruce Ismay fell afoul of the rumour because he was the chairman of White Star Line, and many people felt he should have gone down with his ship. Only one male survivor was encountered wearing an item of women's clothing, third-class passenger Daniel Buckley. He was already in a lifeboat when a female passenger threw her shawl over him to hide him from crew members who were forcing men out of their lifeboat. He kept the shawl on when the lifeboat set out onto the cold waters of the Atlantic. This is the only case of a man escaping Titanic thanks to women's clothing. But his story didn't emerge until after newspapers had already made their claim about the other men. However, even the order to evacuate women and children first wasn't strictly obeyed by First Officer William McMaster Murdoch. He was happy to let men on the boat when he couldn't find any women or children to put on. You may remember Murdoch from the James Cameron movie. He's the Scottish officer who shoots himself after shooting some of the male passengers trying to force their way onto a lifeboat.
Women and children only!
I'll shoot any man who tries to get past me, get back!
This never happened, and there are no purported incidents of crew members killing passengers. The transatlantic speed record. It's a commonly held belief that Captain Smith and his crew were trying to set the transatlantic speed record to win the Blue Ribbon accolade, and as such, ignored multiple warnings about dangerous ice on the route. It is true that Titanic was going at full speed when it hit the iceberg, but it wasn't because Captain Smith was trying to set records. Titanic was built for comfort, not speed. It was about 5 knots slower than the fastest liners of the day. Besides that, the route Smith followed was 200 miles longer than the fastest shipping lane across the Atlantic. Ironically, he chose this route to avoid dangerous ice further north. In reality, the story that Smith was trying to set a speed record comes from American newspapers, in particular from the newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was angry with J. Bruce Ismay for not cooperating with the press, so in addition to printing the rumours about Ismay dressing as a woman to survive Titanic, Hearst made up a story that Ismay ordered Captain Smith to make the crossing in record time, regardless of passenger safety. However, it is true that on the day it sank, Titanic received 6 warnings of dangerous ice ahead. At least 3 of these were reported directly to Captain Smith. The official US Senate inquiry concluded that
no officers' conference was called to consider these warnings. No heed was given to them.
So the US government clearly felt Captain Smith acted badly, but Smith was never able to speak in his defense, and the same Senate report didn't trust witness statements that the ship broke in 2, which we know is exactly what happened. So, why was Smith travelling at full speed through icy waters? Well, the answer may lie in a fire in one of Titanic's coal bunkers. Coal frequently caught fire on steamships thanks to spontaneous combustion, and this happened on Titanic. In 2004, engineer Robert Essenhive pointed out that a common method of controlling fires like these was to shovel the burning coal into the boiler, which means the ship would have had to keep cruising at high speed, although Essenhive admitted he was just speculating. Another myth surrounding Captain Smith is that he was drunk when Titanic hit the iceberg. In truth, he was in his cabin after attending a first-class dinner party, so he probably wasn't in the best frame of mind to steer the ship clear of icebergs. But he didn't have to. Instead, Smith had put First Officer Murdoch in charge, and it was he who had to make the urgent decisions when the lookouts in the crow's nest spotted the iceberg. Witnesses say that Murdoch ordered the engines to reverse and the helm to steer hard starboard, away from the iceberg.
Hard starboard!
This was part of a standard maneuver to sail around obstacles in the water. It might have worked, except that the crew lookouts didn't see the iceberg until it was too late. This is partly because the binoculars in the crow's nest were in a locked case, and no one had the key. In fact, Second Officer Charles Lightoller had promised to buy new binoculars for the lookouts once the ship arrived in New York. Unlike Captain Smith and First Officer Murdoch, Lightoller survived. However, Charles Lightoller's granddaughter, Louise Patton, says Lightoller told her that Murdoch's order to turn hard starboard was misunderstood by the helmsman. This is because the helmsman was trained to steer modern steamships, which issued orders based on the direction of the bow. In contrast, officers like Murdoch trained to use the old-fashioned orders for sailing ships, which were based on the direction of the tiller, and is always opposite to the direction you want the bow to go. So when Murdoch ordered the helmsman to turn hard starboard, or right, he actually wanted the helmsman to put the tiller as far right as possible to starboard, and turn the rudder, the wheel and the bow to the left. Instead, the helmsman turned the wheel right, as he had learned in training. Interestingly, Lightoller's granddaughter revealed this to promote a book she wrote in 2010. Lightoller himself never said a word of this to the authorities investigating the tragedy. Supposedly, he wanted to protect the reputation of the crew and the company, White Star Line. But were these allegations to be true, then the second watch officer who supervised the helmsman's actions would have also missed the error, meaning all three experienced crew members got it wrong. Titanic never sank. That's right, there's a theory about insurance fraud that meant the Titanic ship itself never sank. Instead, some believe its sister ship, the RMS Olympic, was the boat that sank on that fateful night. Originally put forward by theorist Robin Gardner in 1998, the theory goes like this. In 1911, the Olympic collided with a Royal Naval warship. The accident damaged its hull and central turbines, but the ship's insurers refused to pay the $800,000 for repairs. Since the Olympic was being fixed in the same dockyard that the Titanic was being built in, and since Titanic followed the same design as Olympic, the owners decided to swap the ships, sink the Titanic, and collect the insurance to pay for the repairs. The Olympic would continue to sail the seas until it was retired in 1935. But in reality, it was the Titanic. The tragic loss of life occurred because the plan to rescue everyone was completely botched. According to Gardner, the swap would have been relatively easy to achieve, because the ship's name was only put on removable objects like lifeboats and the ship's bell. Even though photographs clearly show that the ship's names were put on their bow, this theory seemed quite plausible until you really think about it. Maritime author Mark Chirnside pointed out that it cost $7.5 million to build Titanic, but White Star Line insured it for just $5 million. This means the loss they made on Titanic was greater than the cost of repairs on the Olympic. Furthermore, the shipwreck has the number 401 stamped all over it. This was Titanic's hull number, not Olympic's. Nevertheless, some people still believe it was a scam, and that the scam was the brainchild of the owner of White Star Line, JP Morgan. The theories involving JP Morgan don't stop there either. He was one of the most powerful bankers of the time, and if the financier didn't sink Titanic as part of an insurance fraud, he orchestrated it to kill his rivals who opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve. But the titanic weight of evidence against this theory being true might explain why there's another version of it floating around on the internet that says the Rothschilds planned it. But there's even less proof for this than the Morgan theory. So I'm afraid for all the conspiracy enthusiasts out there, the story of Titanic is simply a tragic example of a maritime disaster.
Part 3. Giant Indians and Child Sacrifice. It would not be until 2007 that American preacher and Christian mystic Timothy Bence uncovered the complete, ancient, and insidious truth about Jekyll Island. The following is an interview with Bence, hosted in 2012 by Rob Skiba, entitled Canaanite Altars and the Federal Reserve. Although this interview has been circulated on YouTube by others, it will be presented here unedited.
So, make long story short, when I was over in Europe and we had dealt with some of these, I came back from this trip where the big Canaanite altar had been done, and I just had been gone for 3 months. That whole trip was a 3-month ordeal, and I was ready to make a beeline home and take some rest. And my wife and children had been over with me for part of it. They had come back to Oklahoma, and I was missing my family. I just wanted to get off the plane, and I had a car in New York because my brother lives there, and we had drove out there to visit with him and some friends. And I just wanted to make a beeline home in my car and not stop for anything but gas. When I landed in New York, the Holy Spirit said to me, I know you want to get home. I know you're missing your family. But I need you to do one more thing before you go. And he said, the timing is important. Before you go back to Oklahoma, go down to Jekyll Island, Georgia. Jekyll Island. And I said, Lord, I don't even know, I knew something about Jekyll Island. I had looked at some of the financial issues in the 80s and 90s. I was looking at some of the spiritual applications to financial things, but I really was not up to speed on the history of Jekyll Island. I had just heard it from something. I'd not even read the book that's called The Creature of Jekyll Island. I'd not even read that book, but I was aware of something about Jekyll Island and financial stuff. So I went in my brother's house, got my computer out, and I just, got on the internet and typed in Jekyll Island, and was like, what's going on with Jekyll Island? And was praying and asking the Lord, why do I need to go there? And he said, when you get there, I will explain to you what you need to do. But he just told me, he says, go to the island and plan to spend. It's not that far from New York, but he said, I need you to tarry for a day or two and listen to me. I'll tell you what to do. So I discovered when I got online that the Jekyll Island Club, which was this historical, multi-millionaires country club that had been built in the turn of the century, it had just been remodeled and reopened. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And immediately the Spirit of the Lord said, that's where I want you, book a room there. And so I just booked me a room for that night, then got in the car and headed that way. All the way down there, I'm driving and I'm praying, and I don't like. I know when the Lord tells me to do something like that, I have to obey. At the same time, I'm one of these guys that I don't like doing anything alone. I don't think God sends people alone. I think He often wants us to go in twos or threes, right. And I'm not afraid to go alone, but it's just like, Lord, where's my little buddy Eliyahu? Where's my, there's got to be something important, or God would not be diverting me. And I don't know anybody in Jekyll Island, so I'm thinking, who do I know in Georgia that I can call? Maybe there's somebody that can come over and join me. And I just was complaining a little bit. It's like, Lord, I'm tired. I've been gone for a long time. I'd really rather be going home. what's so important about Jekyll Island that I got to go there now? And the Lord just encouraged me. He's like, son, please don't complain. I don't ask you to do something unless it's important. I'm directing your steps, and this must be done now. So I quit complaining and grumbling, and I just started praying and cheering up. And so I tried to just pray in the Spirit all the way down there. When I got to the hotel, it was about 9 o'clock at night. And one of the things that I've learned is that whenever God's doing something territorially, He almost always has someone on site that's ready to open the door to Him. Mm-hmm. I call them gatekeepers. In Chronicles, David ordained 4,000 gatekeepers as king, and we need to understand that anointing a little better. That's another story. But I often come into a place, if it's the first time I'm there, and I'm asking, Lord, connect me up with who you already know or who you got your hand on that's able to open the door to your Spirit and what you want to do. And so I expect God to order my steps, and I try to go with my ears and my eyes open, looking for the local that God has His hand on. And they're not always hard to find if you're praying that way. So I walked into the hotel, and the lady behind the desk calls out my name. She says, "Are you Mr. Bentz?" And I said, "Boy, you're really good at your job," because I hadn't said anything yet. She said, "Well, you're the last one to check in. I just kind of figured that you must be Mr. Bentz." And so it was just a little bit of an exchange that was odd. It was not a normal way to start a conversation on her end. I was a little bit impressed that she was up to speed on her job and she knew who I was. So I asked her, I said, do you look at all the names? How did you know I was the only one left? And she said, well, I was actually here last night when you booked your reservation. I assigned you your room last night. So I realized that you had not checked in yet, so I was looking for you. So I said, well, okay. And then she got this real funny look on her face. And I know if that kind of looked like she's sitting there like she wants to say something else but isn't sure if she should. And I asked her, I said, I'm here for a real interesting purpose, and if you know something else, please tell me. She goes, no, I don't. I'm not sure I should say it. And I said, no, I want to hear it. So I looked at her and I said, look, I'm a spiritual man, and I believe God's doing something with me, and I need to be here, but I don't know why I'm here. So I looked at her and says, you work here. You live in this area. Why am I here? And she said, well, I did hear something really strange when I booked your reservation, but I don't have that kind of experience very often, so it's uncomfortable for me to say it. I said, well, please tell me just whatever you know. Don't worry about it. I experience this kind of stuff all the time. She said, well, I was sitting in the office and I was booking the reservations, and when your reservation came in over the internet, I assigned you your room. I said, well, that's not unusual. So what did you do? What made that different? She said, well, I heard this voice inside me, and that's never happened to me before. I said, what did you hear? She said, I heard this voice said, he's an ambassador. I'm sending him. Give him the presidential suite. And she looked at me. She says, are you a real ambassador that's kind of incognito or something? Because I looked up your name, and you're not an ambassador of a country. I said, I kind of laughed. I said, I'm not an ambassador of a nation that you understand, but I was sent by the Lord Jesus. He's the King of kings and Lord of lords, and the word ambassador is one that's sent on an errand. I'm representing him. I am here to represent him. And I said, he's the one that's important, that's coming on your hotel site, not me. And she said, well, I gave you the presidential suite. But I was kind of thought it interesting what I heard, because that's not normal for me to hear something like that. And so I said, do you know Jesus? Do you know the Lord? as you're saying? She said, yeah, I believe in God and I believe in Jesus. I just don't hear like that. You know? So I said, well, did you hear anything else? She said, yes, as a matter of fact, there was one other thing. I heard that I needed to give you the presidential suite, that you needed to be here for 2 nights, not 1. So I booked your reservation just like you asked for it, but I've also reserved you for another night. And I did that without pay. I'm applying your payment to both nights. So you're getting the presidential suite for the price of 1 night, for 2 nights. And she said, I heard that I needed to introduce you to the gentleman that is in charge of our museum on the island, and a few others that work here at the hotel that have lived here most of their lives. I said, okay. That sounds like you heard a word from God. And don't ever be afraid of that. Listen to his voice and let him lead and guide your steps. And thank you very much for telling me. You know, this is going to be fun. We're going to figure out what he wants to do. And I had no idea that it would relate to some of the other things, but I just thought that was so much fun. It was like one minute I'm feeling alone, another minute it's like God's already got somebody on site that's hearing him and obeying him. Even though it was her first time to have an experience like that, she was obeying what she heard. That's what's critically important when we're doing spiritual warfare. It's not just to run into the battlefield and try to take down the demons, but it's to hear and obey. So anyway, it was 9 o'clock. She texts me in and she tells me, we'll take care of your bag. We'll have the valet park your car. She said, your room includes supper and breakfast, and the restaurant's only open till 10, so if you want to, go right on in there and get you a meal. We'll get your stuff up to your room, and you can go up there in a little bit. And then you need to come down sometime before 10 o'clock and have your breakfast. And so I went in the restaurant and had a good meal and went to my room and got some rest. And the next morning I went down for breakfast, and a different lady was at the desk, but she had a note for me. It said that I had an appointment arranged with the museum director, and that he was blocking out most of the day to spend with me. So I had my breakfast, and then when I went over to meet with him. Again, I'm just there. I don't know personally yet why I'm there. I'm just hearing and obeying what I do know. But I'm rested and I'm well fed and I've been taken good care of, and the presidential suite was fabulous. And it was like, Lord, why did you give me this? I didn't ask for it. I didn't ask for a special VIP treatment. Why are you doing this? So when I asked the lady at the desk, the one that I had met the night before was not there, so I said, this is a pretty nice room, what you guys put me in. And she looked at me, she goes, no one has stayed in that room since 1948. It's been totally remodeled. You're the first guest that actually has stayed in there since it's remodeled. She said, the last person that stayed there was the actual president. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I'm sitting there just pondering the idea of that, not getting caught up in the luxury of the room, but just thinking, what is it about that room that God was wanting to invade? And thinking it's not about me having a nice king-size bed and some luxury. It's about him coming in and doing something himself. Why did he need the presidential suite? Why does he want to do something in Jekyll Island? And those are the way I'm questioning and praying. So I go meet with the museum gentleman. His name is John. And when I go meet with him, I just introduced myself. I told him a little bit about who I was and what I do. He was not a very spiritual guy, so he respected it, but he just kind of told me right off the bat, I don't really understand prayer and intercession, that kind of stuff. He said, I believe in God, but I'm not very spiritual. Then I said, well, that's okay. You're still important. There's something you know that I need to know. And I said, I don't know if you'll understand it, but the King of Kings set this appointment up. There's something you know I need to know. And I'll pray for you, and I'll pray for the business here, and I'll pray for whatever it is that God wants, but just please attend to this as something very, very important, you know. And thank you for your time. So we started talking. He was, of course, started out talking about the financial stuff, because this Jekyll Island is where the Federal Reserve banking system was birthed and conceived. And at one time, when it was functioning in the 1900s up to the 20s and 30s, some say 1/3, some say 2/3 of the world's wealth would vacation on that island. Mm-hmm. It was the highest conglomeration of wealth in a single place very often anywhere in the world back in the turn of the century. So it just seems like a little island that's not anything significant at all now, but it's amazing to see the financial side of the history of that spot. And so I'm sitting there looking at some of the things that he's telling, and just thinking about some of the things he's telling me. We went out and walked around, and he showed me some of the cottages that had been restored, and the club itself, and the tennis courts, and you know, they had a pier where the boats would come up, and he's just kind of showing me the grounds, and then we go to the museum. And he's talking a lot about the financial stuff and the guys that built it, and each cottage was, you know, marked and named. Some of them had been restored, some of them didn't exist anymore, but they had like a sign that this is where this one was, and that one was built by J.P. Morgan, that one was Rockefeller's, and you know, that one was just they had each one of them named. Well, they're all kind of native names, and then they're all, you know, got some kind of a plaque on who the financial mogul was that had built them. And they're not really elaborate, luxurious mansions. They're just simple cottages for the most part, which was kind of interesting to know that the richest people in the world built them, and they were very low-key and almost like a, you know, cabin in the woods instead of a luxurious house like you'd expect. And they all had Indian names. So I started asking him about the Indian history of the island, and he lit up. He just was like, that's what he really wanted to talk about, because he loved the Indian history. And so he takes me back to the museum, and he said, we got a lot of stuff on the Indians. He said this was actually like the government main community for a tribe of Indians that don't exist anymore. That tribe was called the Timucas. And I said, well, that's interesting. My name's Tim. And anyway, I didn't know anything about the Timucas. I'm from Oklahoma. I've learned a lot of native history, and I have some native bloodline, but I did not know anything about the Timucas. So I just asked him, please tell me everything that you can tell me about them. There's something about the natives that I feel like I need to know. So he said, well, the Jekyll Island Club was actually built on top of everything that the Indians had. So they just kind of wiped the village out and built the club on top of it. So wherever the chief's house was, there was a cottage now. Wherever the council house was, there was now the Jekyll Island Hotel. You know? And he said everything that's built and visible today is actually sitting right on top of something that was significant in the Indian village when it existed. So he said the fact that this whole place had to go into ruins and then be rebuilt and become an archaeological state park, he said it actually helped us identify the native history, because the club itself had almost erased that. You know? Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, you know, let's look at the museum. I want to see some of the Indian stuff. So we're looking at arrowheads and spear tips and, you know, just artifacts that they had found, and pottery shards and things, and seashells that they had had. And he's showing me all their stuff in the museum. he shows me some fragments of a weapon that was like an unusual bow. And when I say unusual, I mean that it was like a double curved bow. And that was a very unusual shape of a bow for a native tribe. I had never seen that shape before with an American Indian tribe. And I've seen a lot of bows and arrows. So I asked him, I said, this seems unusual. I've not seen this before. In Oklahoma, every native tribe, the bows would look like a single bow or just a single curve. I said, this is quite extraordinary, especially as far back as this tribe was. So he said, yeah, we found a lot of weapon-type artifacts that we've not seen with other tribes. And I said, well, how do you know these were Native Americans? Maybe they were from somewhere else. He said, oh, no, they were the Timia, because they're well established along the Florida and Georgia coast, and he said we got a lot of stuff in 3 or 4 states about them, and they were quite prolific at one time. So he said, we know they're Native Americans. I said, well, all right, what else you got? He said, well, we got some skeletons. He said, do you want to see the bones? And I said, well, yeah. That sounds, don't get to see a skeleton very often. I said, are they where we can actually see them, or are they buried? He said, no, they're visible. So they had a burial site that they had been very respectful for when they built the museum. When they found a burial site, they didn't move the bones. They left them where they were, and they just uncovered them to where they were visible, and then they built the museum on top of it. They did basically the same thing with the museum that the Jekyll Island guys had done with their houses. They put a piece of plexiglass over the burial site so you could see it, but they were still trying to respect where the bones were and not move them. And so I'm looking at 4 skeletons of the Timucua chiefs. And they knew they were chiefs just from different things that were buried with them. So all of a sudden I look and I realize, man, these guys are really tall. And I commented to the guy that, how tall are these guys? They look unusually large. And he said, yeah, they're all about 8 or 8.5 foot tall. I was like, well, that doesn't seem like a normal Native American, especially the tribes that I'm familiar with. He said all the Timucuas were unusually tall, even the women. And he said we found other skeletons and parts of bones out in the grounds, and he said we've got pretty good evidence that nearly all of them were extraordinarily tall. And I said, well, what is how do you explain that in relation to other tribes on the Atlantic coast who were not? He said, I don't know. It is an unusual anomaly. He said, oh, by the way, I've got a painting that you might want to see. It's actually the copy of the original. We've got it under lock and key. So I got a painting that actually shows the Indians from a group of French colonists that came to the United States before it was the U.S. This was right after Columbus. He said that it was the first colony of French folks that came over to try to establish a colony on the coast. And he said they landed in Jekyll Island, and they had some interaction with these Indians, and then they got so appalled by what they saw and witnessed that they fled at night and ended up in San Augustine, Florida, and established that city. So I said, were they the Huguenots who were the French group that established San Augustine? He said, yes. I said, well, I'd like to see that painting then. So he pulls that out. I'm looking at it, and it shows the Indians and all their regalia, and they're dancing around and having some kind of a ceremony, and it's got the fire, and it's a typical, either they're having a party or they're having a war scene, and it has some things with the weapons. So I said, gosh, this has got some weapons in it that clearly validates the archaeology that they found. And then I see an altar. And I'm going, I don't know of a Native American tribe anywhere in the country. I know some that had log houses or high places or worshipped, nature in some way. or had totem poles or that kind of stuff, but this one has a stone altar, and it looks a whole lot like the one that I had dealt with in the Middle East. And I'm looking at the picture and I'm going, is this an altar? Is this stone like something they're sacrificing on? Because this guy's holding babies in his hands in this picture. He said, yeah, they're cutting those babies, they're hacking those babies up in that painting. And so when you look at the details, two of the shamans or chiefs are holding a baby up by the ankles, and they're whacking their heads off and spilling the blood on this altar. Mm. And I'm like, sir, I don't want to be disrespectful of your training and archaeological understanding and history, but I don't know of any native tribe that did what I'm seeing here, unless it was an act of war. And this is really, really unusual. And I've seen this type of scene with artifacts over in the Middle East. And I've seen weapons like this over in the Middle East. I said, are you sure this is Native Americans and not some kind of colony that came from over there? And he was convinced they were Native, and I said, well, I'd like to show you some things on a few websites that identify artifacts in the Middle East countries, and especially Egypt and Israel and Syria and Jordan area, and some of those spots where there's some of these ancient groups. And I said, this type of altar, this type of religious ceremony, and some of these weapons, I've seen them before over there. Well, he was quite interested in that because he loves Native American history, but he's starting to question, maybe I need to dig into this more. That was his comment. So I said, at that point, then I thought, I believe this is why I'm here. I needed to see this and hear about this. At this point, I'm not that concerned about the financial stuff anymore. I'm wanting to know, where is this altar? And so I asked him, I said, can you take me to this altar? I often pray over these things, and it's very beneficial for the land and for the country and for the people. Can I go to this altar and see it? He said, I can take you to the altar, but you can't see it. And I said, why can't I see it? Is it buried? He said, no, it's not buried, but it has a house built on top of it. I said, who would be crazy enough to build their house on top of a blood sacrifice altar? He said, well, Rockefeller was. So, nice. I just okay, can we go there? And he said, yeah, it's just a short walk. Come on. And we've actually, I'd already walked by it. So he said, I've got the keys. He said, normally nobody can go in. The way these things are set up, they're historical homes now. The state of Georgia owns the park. They lease out to another group, the hotel, to run, but the houses are maintained on the National Historical Register, and they're part of the state park. So you can't go in any of them without a guided tour or permission, but you can go look in the windows and walk on the porches and walk all around them. And they're set up inside just like they were when they were actually being used back in the 20s and earlier. So we go over there, and he's got the keys, though. So we go into the house, and he takes me into the parlor, and he says, well, I know you're a praying guy, so you probably would like to have a little time to pray. He said, you're standing right on top of the altar right now. This is the room that is built on top of it. He said, I'm just going to go over here and sit down for a few minutes and read the newspaper, and I'll let you pray and do whatever you need to do.
Now, this parlor, that's where those guys, J.P. Morgan and all those guys, actually conceived of the Federal Reserve, right? Right over that altar.
That's exactly right. It's the room that they were sitting in when they drew up the entire legislation and plan to pass it that became the Federal Reserve Act.
Wow.
So this was the conception of the Federal Reserve banking system. on the parlor sitting on top of a blood sacrifice altar.
Where babies were sacrificed.
Yes. And so all of a sudden it's like, wow, no wonder our banking system has so much corruption in it, even when people want to do the right thing, you know.
No kidding.
And so, just being a banker is not an easy job, but it's like, not all of them are bad guys, but it's like, wow. And that was not what our founders set up. That took over. It usurped the authority of the way our founding fathers suggested that we bank as a country. And even the way it was passed had a lot of, things that didn't seem right about it. But the idea that it was conceived like this, I'm going, this is not just a bunch of wealthy guys that got away for a vacation and came up with a profitable business plan. This has got something diabolical, something occultic about it, something evil that's wrapped up with it.
Yeah.
And so even if it had been a good idea and something beneficial for the country, which many would argue that it was, this demonic power must have gotten into it. That's what happens when an altar is not dealt with. That's what happens when God's people do not do spiritual warfare the way He tells us to.
Right.
Then we all become subject to it, because they didn't just create a bank, they created a banking system that every one of us have become subject to. So think about this. You've got money that you receive as a ministry, or that when you earn, I'm sure you tithe and give offerings. On your money is idolatry. It's printed right on your money.
Right.
And you're using that money. You're coming into the house of God, and you're laying that idolatrous coin or dollar bill on God's altar and saying, I'm giving you this as an offering.
Wow.
What if the living, holy God hates it?
Wow.
We don't have a choice, because we're subject to it.
Yeah,
it's
that's why they call it circulation, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're circulating a talisman that has evil attached to it right from its conception.
Is it possible, now I'm not saying thus saith the Lord here, but is it possible that a lot of the financial blessings and a lot of the things that God has promised His people, and that we're supposed to be the head, not the tail, and we're supposed to be, we ought to be running the world in a righteous, holy way, not ruling over people in a mean way, but just bringing wisdom to every single industry.
Right.
I think it's real possible that the reason why many people in the body of Christ struggle financially, even when they're doing God's perfect will, even when they're walking out their ministries as best they know, is because we're forced to do business with something idolatry, and we must be bringing a stench before God's eyes when we give Him an offering with it.
Wow. That's why He says that, I don't want your offerings. I want praise. I want worship. I want prayer. It's tough, because everything we do, from eating to living and electricity, everything we do costs money. We're trapped in an evil system.
That's what I'm saying, that we've become subject to it against our will. Either we didn't resist and say, no, we don't want that. We didn't elect our representatives to represent us correctly, because they deviated from righteous wisdom when they passed this bill to allow idolatry become the circulated means of exchange. And the fact that we are subject to that says there's something wrong in the land, not just something wrong with our hearts. There's defilement in the land, and then there's defilement in our hearts. And, all right, now, to relate that to Scripture in one way, without deviating too much from the story, I want to tell you the rest of the altar part. But when I was in Israel the last time, I was studying out with some of the rabbis that I know that passage of Scripture on Jesus turning over the tables. And I was meeting with some Orthodox rabbis, but they were respectful of the fact that I believed that Jesus is, or Yeshua is the Messiah, and I asked them some hard questions. And they asked me some too. But one of the questions I asked them was, why did Yeshua need to turn over the tables at the temple? What was going on? You know, I assumed and had been told by other pastors and ministers that they were probably cheating people at those tables. They weren't giving them a fair exchange. They were, you know, using dishonest scales, and Jesus knew they were cheating, so he threw their tables over. I got quite a different answer from the rabbis. One of them pulled a coin out, and he said, this is an ancient coin. I carry it around because it was minted here in Jerusalem, and it was discovered and found by a friend of mine when we came back to the land in 1948. It was found on the vicinity of the Temple Mount. And he said this was called a Jerusalem shekel. It was minted from the time of David all the way up to the time of the temple being destroyed in 70 A.D. Only it was changed once during that period. He said when David ordered coins to be minted, it had a menorah on it. But during the days of Herod, this coin had the same weight, the same, you know, constitution. It was mostly silver, and it was a set weight exchange. But he said they changed the picture on it. It was no longer menorah; it was the face of Baal.
Yeah.
And so he had the one that had Baal's face on it.
Wow.
And I asked him, I said, you're a holy man. I can tell you love God with all your heart. Doesn't it bother you to carry that coin around? He said, yes, but that's why I carry it around. It reminds me how easy it is for Israel to become subject to idolatry.
Yeah, us too.
Because he said it was priests that minted this coin with the face of Baal.
Wow.
And it was a wicked king named Herod who ordered us to do it. And it was Rome's influence that gave us a benefit for doing it by making it something circulating that would make us wealthy but not holy anymore. And so he said, when Jesus, and he said, I'm not going to try to tell you that I think Yeshua is the Messiah. He was pretty adamant that I don't agree with you on that. But I'm searching that out because my best friend lived his whole life trying to prove that that was not accurate, and he died telling all of us in this room that he had come to the conclusion that Yeshua was the Messiah. And because he was my best friend, I'm searching that out in the Scriptures now for myself. But he said, however, whether that's the case or not, historically, if that's accurate, what Yeshua did, he did Israel the greatest service when he turned those tables over. I said, I don't understand. What exactly did he do? He said, he said publicly, my Father's house is a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. He said, that phrase doesn't mean you're cheating people at the table. It means you're robbing men of their souls.
Wow.
He said the reason was because Herod required a temple tax, and the priests of that day were corrupt, and they required tithes and offerings and taxes to be paid. And the rules in Scripture was that whenever a census was taken, half a shekel for every male had to be paid, whether you were poor or not. And he said Rome required a census to be done every year so they could collect the tax. And so he said to pay that tax, you had to come into the temple and pay it with a shekel or a half shekel. And the only shekels that were allowed were ones with the face of Baal on it.
Wow. The face of Baal in the temple of Jehovah.
Yes.
Wow.
So Jesus was saying to the whole city that day, stop giving your money to these priests. Stop putting it in that offering plate.
Wow.
Don't do this anymore. You're robbing your sons and daughters of their souls because you're trying to bring something idolatrous in front of the face of a living God.
Oh, man. I mean, I've been saying that without even knowing what I'm saying, because this is what you're saying is new revelation for me. But I mean, I've been saying for over a year now that I hate carrying at least $1 bill in my pocket, because that's the whole thing is to Baal. It's Nimrod. I mean, I call them Nimrods.
Well, it's
yeah,
easy to get out of shape
thing.
over it. I mean, it's really easy to get up. When you learn the truth, it's easy to just want to move somewhere else or want to just give all your money away. It's worthless anyway. And at the same time,
right.
But it's our means of exchange. What do we do? You know, I'm thinking about Psalm 11, when the foundations are broken, what do the righteous do? We have to repair the foundations in order to lay hold fully of the righteousness. And then it's not just in our heart, it's not just a hope or a desire, but it should become the law of the land, because it's good for everybody. It's not forcing something on others that's bad. It's giving them righteousness and peace and joy and freedom, which is what our country was established for. So I took note of that, and I'm sitting there at Jekyll Island suddenly, and the rabbi's words were ringing in my spirit, and I'm just weeping, going, Jesus, we've become subject to something evil. We're being robbed of our souls. Is this going on in your temple in America, like it was going on when you turned the tables over in the Temple Mount?
Yeah.
And the Lord just, I mean, absolutely it is. And it's not just that, but it's got a blood oath and a covenant with something evil attached to it. And its evil design is to enslave you. And while I'm standing in the parlor, the Holy Spirit says these words to me. He said, son, are you free? I said, yes, I'm free because you made me free. He said, no, you're not. You're a slave. Because you have debt that you're not fully paid off.
Yeah.
And I said, well, yes, Lord, I know that, but, I'm not behind on my bills. I'm paying it, and I've asked you to clear my debts. I've asked you to help me get that done, and you've promised me you would. He said, I know, but you need to understand what's happening today, why this was so important, why I needed you to come here instead of go home. Because he said, right now, if I gave you the money to pay off all your bills and your house and your car and all your possessions and your credit card, if everything was paid off, would you then be free? And I said, yes, Lord, I wouldn't owe anyone anything but to love them. He said, you still wouldn't be free because you're a citizen of the United States.
Right.
Right now, at this day, you owe about $30,000 just because you're a U.S. citizen, even if your house was paid for and your cars were paid for and you had no other debt. You owe that money because you're a citizen and because your representatives have put that debt on you. And so I said, well, how do we break an altar that I can't see and I can't put my hands on? And I mean, a historical house, I don't want to damage the house. What do I do? And the Lord said something funny to me. He's like, whenever he says my name, it's kind of like Dad. You know how your dad would call your name, and I better pay attention. It's like,
yeah, right.
Timothy, how big is your spirit? Lord, I hate it when you ask me questions like that. I don't know the answer to that. You know the answer. Tell me. He said, how big do you think your spirit is? I said, I really don't know, Lord. I know that, the Word says I sit with you in heavenly places, and I know I'm right here on the earth, that somehow that's possible to be in both places at once. You're in me, and I'm in you. I don't really know how to answer you. He said, you're big enough to sit in my realm and stand there at the same time. You believe that? Yes. He said, I want you to pray until you can see my face and until you can see the altar in the spiritual realm. Don't worry about the other gentleman. He's going to sit quietly while we do my business. I said, all right, Lord. So I started praying. Shut my eyes and began praying intensely. And probably 15 minutes, I began to see in the spiritual realm, and I could see his face. And he was smiling. He was just smiling. It was like he was almost giddy, like he was having fun, getting ready to do something fun. And he's just looking at me. He goes, do this. And he stood next to the altar, and suddenly I could see it, and he's on one side and I'm on the other. And he just says, in my name, and he kicked it. And so I kicked my side, he kicked his side. And a similar thing happened. It wasn't quite as dramatic as what had happened over in the Middle East, but suddenly we heard this crack again. I don't get that. I don't know what that's about, but something breaks in the heavens when this kind of stuff is done.
Yeah.
And our museum buddy jumps out of his chair. He realized, he's like, what did you do? He thought I had broke the floor or something. I said, I didn't do anything. I just prayed. He said, well, I just heard a loud noise. What was that? I said, the demonic power that is dealing with this altar is broken. He said, well, what does that mean? What's going to happen now? I said, I'm not really sure, but I know there's going to be a great change that comes with everything that relates to this altar. So we, finished our talk and walked out. I thanked him for the day, and I went back to my room. Prayed around the island a little bit the next day, and the rest of the day, and then had my supper and started home. About 5 days afterwards, after I was in that parlor, the financial collapse happened here in the United States.